For 7 years, Evelyn Sterling was the invisible hand behind one of Chicago's most feared crime dynasties. She paid the debts. She buried the secrets. She turned a crumbling criminal operation into a billion-dollar empire. And she did it all while standing 2 steps behind a man who never once looked back to thank her. Then came the World Cup tickets. 2 seats she bought as a last act of love. And the morning she woke up to find them gone. Gone with him. Gone with her. Something inside Evelyn Sterling went very, very quiet. Not broken. Not crying. Quiet in the way a woman gets quiet when she has already decided exactly what she is going to do next. Stay with me until the end of this story. If it moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm didn't wake her. Evelyn had been awake since 4. She lay flat on her back in the center of a California king bed that cost more than most people's cars, staring at the ceiling of a penthouse that occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building she had quietly helped finance 3 years ago. The sheets were Italian linen. The air smelled like cedar and dry-cleaned suits, and the faint ghost of a cologne she used to find intoxicating. Now it just smelled like absence. Vincent had left the night before. Business in New Jersey, he'd said. Wouldn't be back until after the weekend. She hadn't asked which business. She already knew. Evelyn sat up slowly, the way a person moves when they've been holding something heavy for a long time and have finally decided to put it down. Not because the weight broke them, but because they simply don't need to carry it anymore. She was 34 years old. She had cheekbones that could cut glass and dark circles under her eyes that 7 years of crisis management and silent sacrifice had carved there permanently. She wasn't beautiful the way women in Vincent's world were usually described as beautiful. Soft, decorative, easy to overlook. She was the other kind of beautiful, the kind that made people in boardrooms shift uncomfortably in their seats without quite knowing why. She walked barefoot across the cold marble floor to the kitchen and made coffee without turning on a light. She knew this kitchen the way she knew every square inch of the life she'd built inside this marriage, by feel, in the dark, without anyone watching. The coffee was black. She drank half of it standing at the window, looking out at Chicago, doing what Chicago always did at 4 in the morning, grinding, moving, indifferent to whatever private disasters were unfolding behind its lit windows. Then she picked up her phone and opened the airline's travel tracker. Vincent's flight had landed at Newark Liberty at 11:47 the previous night. The second name on the reservation, the name she'd found 3 weeks ago buried inside a shared calendar event Vincent had forgotten to make private, was Chloe Bennett. Evelyn set the mug down on the counter, carefully, without a sound. She'd known about Chloe for longer than she'd admitted to herself. Known the way you know something when every piece of evidence has been sitting in front of you for months, and you keep choosing to look at the walls instead. The late nights that came later and later. The phone tilted at angles she was never meant to see. The faint change in how Vincent touched her, or stopped touching her, somewhere around the middle of last year. She told herself it was the pressure of the syndicate's expansion into real estate. She told herself men like Vincent carried stress that manifested in distance, in coldness, in the particular cruelty of making their wives feel invisible without ever raising a hand. She told herself a lot of things. Then she'd found the calendar event, CEB plus VM, MetLife 5i, P-Box, World Cup Final. And she'd understood, with the kind of clarity that only comes after you've run out of excuses, exactly what she was looking at. Because those tickets were hers. She had purchased them 6 weeks ago. 2 VIP seats in the premium box at MetLife Stadium for the 2026 FIFA World Cup Final. It had taken her 4 days of negotiation through her corporate contacts at the stadium, a favor called in from a sports marketing executive she'd helped place 3 years ago, and $48,000 of her own money. Her own. Not the syndicate's operating accounts, not the shell companies, not the intricate financial architecture she had constructed over 7 years to keep Vincent's empire clean and his name untouchable. Her personal account. Money she had earned before Vincent, before Chicago, before she had quietly dismantled her own career to become the invisible engine of someone else's kingdom. She had bought the tickets as a surprise, an anniversary gift, a last genuine attempt to reach whatever was left of the man she had married. She had wrapped the envelope in navy blue, tied it with silver ribbon, and hidden it in the top drawer of her nightstand. 3 weeks ago, the envelope had disappeared. She'd assumed she'd moved it. Then she'd assumed he'd found it early. Then she'd seen the calendar event and stopped assuming anything. Evelyn finished the rest of her coffee cold. She had 5 days before the World Cup final. She had already been preparing for 4. The offices of Harmon and Devane Investigations sat on the 7th floor of a building on West Madison that hadn't been renovated since the 90s. Marcus Harmon was 61, had spent 20 years with the Chicago PD before a disagreement with a politically connected captain ended his career without a ceremony, and operated in the city's shadow economy with a thoroughness that made people uncomfortable when they first saw what he was capable of producing. Evelyn had found him through a source she trusted. She had called him from a burner phone she'd purchased in cash from a convenience store on the north side, given him nothing but a name and an account number, and told him what she needed. He had delivered it in a single manila folder that was 3 inches thick. She sat across from him now in a chair that had stuffing coming out of one armrest, the folder open on the desk between them, and worked through it with the same methodical efficiency she brought to quarterly audits and crisis negotiations. Page by page, photograph by photograph, recording by recording. It was worse than she'd expected, which was saying something because she had expected it to be bad. Chloe Bennett was 26, a marketing associate at a commercial real estate firm that, Evelyn noted without particular surprise, held 2 contracts with businesses in the Moreau portfolio. The affair had been running for 11 months. There were hotel receipts from 9 different cities. There were photographs taken at their anniversary dinner in March. The dinner Vincent had canceled on Evelyn at 3 in the afternoon, citing an emergency with one of the union contacts in Bridgeport, and in the photographs, Vincent was laughing. The unguarded, open-mouthed laugh that Evelyn hadn't seen directed at her in years. There were also financial documents that had nothing to do with the affair. Marcus leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He was a large man, quietly professional, with the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised him anymore. "The last section," he said, "the wire transfers. You're going to want to look at those carefully." She already had. 3 transfers, each for amounts just below the federal reporting threshold, moving through 2 of the Moreau Syndicate's legitimate holding companies into an account registered under a name she didn't recognize. It wasn't the money itself that concerned her. She had handled larger transactions with greater complexity and zero trail. What concerned her was that she hadn't authorized these transfers, hadn't structured them, hadn't even known they existed. Someone had been running money through the architecture she'd built without her knowledge. "How recent?" she asked. "The earliest is 14 months ago. The most recent cleared 9 days ago." Evelyn closed the folder. "Can these be traced back to the source?" Marcus looked at her for a moment. "With the right documentation, yes. To someone who knows what they're looking at, the structure is distinctive. Forensic accountants would call it a signature." "My signature," she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She picked up the folder and stood. "Thank you, Marcus. I'll be in touch." "Mrs. Moreau." "Sterling," she said without turning around. "Evelyn Sterling." She took the stairs down instead of the elevator. 7 flights. She needed to think, and thinking required movement, and movement required stairs. By the time she pushed through the ground floor door into the gray Chicago morning, the outline of what she needed to do had arranged itself in her mind with the clean geometric precision of a deal structure. She had assets to protect. She had evidence to deploy. She had one person she needed to speak to before any of this could move forward. And that conversation was going to be the hardest thing she had done in 7 years. Margaret Moreau lived in a townhouse in Lincoln Park that she had occupied for 38 years and refused to leave, despite the fact that her son had offered to install her in something 3 times the size in River North. The house smelled like good coffee and cedar furniture polish and the particular closed-window stillness of a woman who kept her own counsel. She was 67, silver-haired, straight-backed, with brown eyes that had watched her husband build the Moreau Syndicate from the ground up, and had watched her son inherit it and had never once flinched at what that required. She was not a soft woman. She was not a sentimental woman. She had attended the weddings and the funerals with equal composure and had never embarrassed the family in public, which was the thing that mattered most in the world she had chosen to live inside. She had also always been kind to Evelyn, in the carefully calibrated way of a woman who respected competence, recognized it in another woman, and filed that recognition away without ever quite acknowledging it out loud. Evelyn arrived at 10 in the morning, unannounced. Margaret opened the door herself, looked at Evelyn's face, and stepped back without a word to let her in. They sat in the front room. Margaret poured coffee without asking. Evelyn set her phone on the table between them, screen down, and gathered herself. "I need you to hear something," Evelyn said. "Before I tell you what it is, I need you to understand that I'm not here because I want to damage your son. I'm here because you deserve the truth, and because I believe you're the only person in this family who will do the right thing with it once you have it." Margaret's face didn't move. "Play it." Evelyn turned the phone over and pressed play. Vincent's voice came through the speaker with the casual, unhurried confidence of a man who believed he was completely alone. "The tickets are a statement, not a vacation. You understand that, right? Chloe, listen to me. Walking into that stadium with you, in those seats, in front of people who matter, that's how it's done. That's how you make it official without making a scene. Evelyn doesn't go to these things publicly anyway. She's the background. She knows that. But you're going to be seen. That's the point." A pause. Then Chloe's voice, younger, slightly breathless. "So this is like announcing something?" Vincent, "It's showing the families who the next queen is without saying a word." Silence. Margaret's coffee cup sat untouched. Evelyn reached over and stopped the recording. She watched Margaret's face work through something complicated. Not shock exactly, because women who had lived Margaret's life were rarely shocked by what men were capable of. Something more like recognition. The particular exhaustion of watching a pattern repeat itself in the next generation that you'd spent 30 years hoping wouldn't. "There's more," Evelyn said. "Financial irregularities inside the legitimate holdings. Transfers I didn't authorize, running through structures I built. If federal investigators find them before anyone inside the organization does, the legal exposure isn't just to Vincent. It touches everyone connected to those entities." Margaret was quiet for a long time. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled down the street. Somewhere in the back of the house, a clock ticked. "What are you going to do?" Margaret finally asked. "I'm protecting myself," Evelyn said. "I'm filing for divorce. I'm separating every legal asset I brought into and built inside this marriage. And I'm going to make sure that when things come apart, and they will come apart, Margaret, the foundation is already cracked. It comes apart in a way that doesn't bury people who don't deserve to be buried." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "And my son? Your son made his choices." Evelyn's voice was flat. Not cruel, just finished. "He made them over and over again. I kept finding reasons to stay. I kept finding reasons to believe the man I married was still in there somewhere. But I listened to that recording and I understood. He's been doing the calculation on me for a long time. I was useful. Now he's decided I'm replaceable." She picked up her phone. "He forgot that the thing that made me useful is the same thing that makes me dangerous." Margaret set down her coffee cup. She folded her hands in her lap in the precise way she folded her hands when she had made a decision that she would not be revisiting. "What do you need from me?" "What?" Evelyn spent the afternoon in the offices of Diane Voss, a divorce attorney whose reputation in Chicago had less to do with courtroom eloquence and more to do with the specific quality of fear her name produced in opposing counsel. Diane was 52, had handled 3 divorces connected to organized crime families, and had never once lost a client's assets to a husband who thought money made him untouchable. She reviewed the documentation Evelyn had brought with the focused silence of someone reading a battle map. "The prenuptial is manageable," she said, without looking up. "You've contributed beyond what's outlined in the asset schedule. Significantly beyond. The legitimate holdings you've built since the marriage are documented here, here, and here. The financial irregularities you've flagged are interesting. Depending on how those are characterized, they could actually strengthen your claim for equitable distribution." "I'm not interested in his money," Evelyn said. "I want mine." Diane looked up. "Then you'll have it. All of it." She tapped the folder. "Do you want to move on this before or after the weekend?" Evelyn thought about Vincent in a hotel room in New Jersey right now, probably ordering room service, probably showing Chloe something on his phone, probably feeling the loose, relaxed confidence of a man who believed his life was perfectly arranged. Before, she said, file Friday morning. She spent Thursday evening doing three things. She transferred every asset held in her name alone: the consulting fees, the event company equity she'd retained from before the marriage, the investment accounts Vincent had never known the full scope of, because she had learned very early that a woman in her position needed things that were entirely her own, into a protected trust managed by a financial services firm in a building on Michigan Avenue that had no connection whatsoever to the Moreau Syndicate's orbit. She placed two phone calls. The first was to a contact at a federal law enforcement office she had cultivated carefully over the preceding 3 years, a relationship built on the kind of professional courtesy that doesn't get documented. She told him where to look and what he would find there, and which forensic accountant she would recommend to interpret what he found. The second call was to a sports marketing executive at MetLife Stadium, a man named Derek Chu, who owed her a favor of the kind that doesn't expire. I need to transfer one of the VIP seats, she told him. Same box, different name on the access credential. Which name? Margaret Moreau. A pause. Is everything okay, Evelyn? Everything is exactly as it should be, she said. Thank you, Derek. She hung up, stood at the window for a long moment, and looked out at the city. Somewhere in New Jersey, Vincent Moreau was sleeping the deep, satisfied sleep of a man who believed he had already won. He had no idea that the woman who had spent 7 years making him powerful had spent the last 5 days ensuring that the moment he walked into MetLife Stadium beside Chloe Bennett, the most public stage he had ever chosen would become the site of the most precise, perfectly constructed ambush of his life. The World Cup final was in 48 hours, and Evelyn Sterling had not bought those tickets to watch a football match. The divorce filing hit Vincent's attorney's inbox at 9:14 on Friday morning. Evelyn knew the exact time because Diane Voss sent her a confirmation timestamp with the precision of a woman who understood that in certain kinds of war, documentation was ammunition. Evelyn was sitting in a window booth at a coffee shop on Wabash when the message came through, both hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, watching the Friday morning foot traffic move past the glass with the indifferent momentum of a city that did not care about her marriage or its ending. She read the timestamp. She set the phone face down on the table. She drank her coffee. She felt nothing she had expected to feel. No relief. No grief. No the floor-dropping-out sensation she'd braced herself for during the drive over. What she felt instead was a very specific kind of stillness, the kind that comes not from peace, but from the absence of a weight so familiar you'd stopped noticing it was there until the moment it lifted and the sudden lightness was almost disorienting. 7 years. She turned the phone back over and opened her contacts. There were calls to make. The day was not going to manage itself. A meet. 3 blocks north, in a corner office on the 14th floor of a building that housed 3 shell companies and 1 legitimate architecture firm, a man named Gerald Pruitt was having the worst morning of his professional life without yet knowing why. Gerald was 58, the Moreau Syndicate's primary legal counsel for its legitimate operations, a position he had occupied for 11 years with the steady, well-compensated comfort of a man who had long since made peace with the moral geography of his career. He was good at his job. He was discreet. He billed $460 an hour, and he did not ask questions whose answers would inconvenience him. He had received the divorce filing at 9:14. He had read it twice. Then he had called Vincent's cell phone 4 times in 11 minutes, getting voicemail each time, because Vincent Moreau was in a hotel suite in New Jersey with the Do Not Disturb setting engaged and his phone charging on the far side of the room. Gerald then called Danny Rourke. Danny was Vincent's chief of operations, the man who managed the day-to-day logistics of the syndicate's business interests with the blunt efficiency of someone who had grown up in Bridgeport, done 2 years for aggravated assault at 23, and spent the subsequent 3 decades making himself indispensable to the Moreau organization. He was 44, compact, with a jaw like a cinder block and eyes the color of dirty ice. He and Evelyn had maintained a civil, professional relationship for 7 years, built almost entirely on mutual wariness and the shared understanding that they were both, in their different ways, essential to the same machine. He picked up on the second ring. "She filed," Gerald said. A pause that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Filed what?" "Divorce." This morning. Voss is the attorney. Another pause, longer. Diane Voss? Yes. Danny said nothing for a moment. Gerald could hear him breathing. Then, how bad? The asset schedule is, she's claiming equitable contribution to the legitimate holdings going back to the start of the marriage, which is not without basis. Gerald stopped, reconsidered his phrasing, which is substantially supported by documentation I was not aware she had retained. What kind of documentation? The thorough kind, Danny. The line went quiet again. When Danny spoke, his voice had dropped into the register he used when he was working through something he didn't like the shape of. Does Vincent know? I've been calling him for 20 minutes. I'll handle it. A beat. Don't do anything until you hear from me. The call ended. Gerald set his phone down and stared at the filing on his screen and thought about the 11 years he had spent building careful professional distance from questions he didn't ask, and wondered, not for the first time, whether that distance was going to be enough. Danny called Vincent from the hotel lobby after taking a car from the Moreau Organization's Chicago office to O'Hare and catching the first available flight to Newark. He did not tell Vincent he was coming. He told Vincent to answer his phone, which was a different thing entirely. Vincent picked up on the first ring this time. His voice was loose, mourning slow, carrying the particular ease of a man who had not yet intersected with the news that was waiting for him. Danny, what? Evelyn filed for divorce this morning. Silence. Vincent, I heard you. The ease was gone. In its place was something harder, and underneath the hardness, something that Danny, who had known Vincent Moreau for 22 years, recognized as the specific quiet of a man recalculating. Voss? Yeah. How far along? Gerald says the asset documentation she's produced is extensive. She doesn't have access to the core accounts. No, but she's claiming the legitimate holdings, the event company equity, the real estate management contracts, the hospitality subsidiaries. Gerald's language was substantially supported, which means he's worried. Vincent breathed out through his nose. Danny could picture him, standing at a hotel window probably, the same way he always stood when he was absorbing bad news, weight back on his heels, jaw set. She's bluffing. Vincent, Danny kept his voice even. Diane Voss doesn't take cases to bluff. She takes cases to win. Then we counter. We freeze the joint accounts, She already moved her personal assets, everything in her name alone. It was done by Thursday night according to Gerald's timeline. A pause. She's been planning this for a while. The silence on the line had a different quality now, denser. Danny waited it out. Where are you? Vincent finally asked. Newark. I'm 20 minutes from your hotel. The line went dead without a goodbye, which was how Vincent ended calls when he was furious and didn't want whoever he was talking to hear it in his voice. Danny pocketed his phone and walked out of the terminal into the gray New Jersey morning and got into the waiting car and thought about the expression on Evelyn Sterling's face the last time he'd seen her in the syndicate's boardroom, 3 months ago, presenting a quarterly restructuring proposal with the calm, comprehensive authority of someone who had done this so many times that the performance of it had become invisible, the competence indistinguishable from the air in the room. He had always thought, privately and without ever saying so to anyone, that Evelyn was the most dangerous person connected to the Moreau organization. Not dangerous the way the men with guns were dangerous. Dangerous the way a structural engineer is dangerous. Because she understood the load-bearing elements, and if she ever decided to remove one, the whole thing would come down before anyone figured out what had happened. He stared out the window at the Newark skyline and thought, she didn't just remove one. She's been removing them for weeks. The hotel suite was on the 31st floor. Danny knocked. Vincent opened the door himself, which meant Chloe was either in the other room or had been sent somewhere, and Vincent's face had the tightly controlled arrangement of someone managing a significant internal pressure. He stepped back and Danny came in. The suite was expensive, floor-to-ceiling windows, a living area with a view of the Manhattan skyline across the river, the kind of room that communicated a specific statement about who you were and what you were owed by the world. Danny had been in rooms like this with Vincent 100 times. He had never once found the view particularly interesting. He sat down in a chair without being invited to. Vincent stood. Tell me everything, Gerald said. Vincent said. Exactly, Danny told him. He did not soften it because softening it would have been both pointless and disrespectful, and because 22 years of loyalty had earned him the right to be direct in private, even when directness was the last thing Vincent wanted to hear. Vincent listened without interrupting. When Danny finished, he walked to the window and stood with his back to the room, hands in the pockets of the dark slacks he'd been wearing when he answered the door. She's angry, Vincent said. She found out about Chloe and she's retaliating. Danny looked at him. Vincent. It's emotional. Women do this. She retained Diane Voss. Danny's voice was patient in the way a man's voice gets patient when he is saying something for what he suspects will not be the last time. She moved her assets before she filed. She has documentation that Gerald, who has been managing your legal structure for 11 years, describes as thorough. This is not emotional. He leaned forward in the chair. This was planned. Something moved across Vincent's face. Not quite acknowledgement. Something adjacent to it that he shut down quickly. How long? We don't know. Guess. Weeks, maybe longer. Danny paused. The financial irregularities Gerald mentioned in the holdings, the transfers that don't have her signature structure, those are handled. Are they? It wasn't a question. Vincent turned from the window. His face was doing the thing it did when he was recalibrating, reassigning the geometry of a situation to fit a new understanding. Danny had watched this process happen hundreds of times over 2 decades and had always found it impressive and occasionally terrifying. You're saying she knows about those transfers. I'm saying if she has as much documentation as Gerald believes she has, and if she's been looking as carefully as this filing suggests she's been looking, then yes, she probably knows. The silence in the room had weight now. From somewhere in the back of the suite, barely audible through a closed door, came the sound of a television. Chloe, presumably, giving them space without having been asked, which was a kind of intelligence Danny noted and filed without comment. She won't go to the feds, Vincent said. She's too exposed. Everything she built inside the organization implicates her by association. She built clean, Danny said. You know that. Whatever she built with enough structural separation that it holds up. That was the whole point. That was why you needed her. He let that sit for a moment. If she's documented the transfers and she knows they ran through her architecture without her authorization, she's not exposed. She's a victim. The exposure is yours. Vincent stared at him. The expression on his face had moved past controlled now into something raw. Not anger exactly, but the emotion underneath anger, the one that doesn't have a clean name and feels like realizing you've been standing on ice that was never as thick as you believed. Get Gerald on a plane tonight, Vincent said. I want him here. And tomorrow? A pause. Tomorrow is the World Cup final. We go. We go exactly as planned. Danny looked at him for a long moment. Vincent, we go. His voice had the finality of a door being closed. She wants to embarrass me. She wants me rattled. I'm not going to hand her that by running home with my tail between my legs. He straightened his shoulders. Whatever she's planning it from Chicago. I'm here. I have the tickets. I have the seat. And I am walking into that stadium tomorrow exactly the way I planned to walk in. Danny stood. He had known Vincent long enough to recognize when an argument was finished before it started. He also knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who had survived 22 years in an organization that did not reward poor judgment, that Vincent was making a mistake. Not a tactical mistake. Something deeper. The kind of mistake that comes from confusing what you want to be true with what is actually true, and then building a plan on the foundation of that confusion. He didn't say any of this. He picked up his jacket and walked to the door. I'll call Gerald, he said. He was in the elevator, descending, when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. 3 words and an attachment. Check the seats. He opened the attachment. It was a MetLife Stadium VIP box seating chart. 2 seats were highlighted in the premium section. The seats registered under the Moreau reservation, seats he himself had confirmed 3 weeks ago through the syndicate's sports entertainment contacts. Both seats were shown as active. Both access credentials were valid. But the name on the second seat had been changed. Danny stared at the screen. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. He stood there while a family with roller luggage tried to navigate around him, not seeing them, reading the name on the second seat one more time to make sure he was reading it correctly. Margaret Moreau. He read it a third time. He stepped out of the elevator and walked to a quiet corner of the lobby and called the number the text had come from. It rang once and went to a message that said the voicemail had not been set up. He lowered the phone. In 22 years with the Moreau organization, Danny Rourke had seen a lot of things. He had seen men make catastrophic errors of judgment and watched the consequences roll outward from those errors like water from a dropped stone. He had seen the organization absorb losses that should have been fatal and emerge functional on the other side. He had been inside rooms where decisions were made that he would carry the knowledge of for the rest of his life. He had never seen anything like this. He thought about calling Vincent back. He stood there for almost a full minute, thumb hovering over the contact, working through the geometry of the next 24 hours with the same blunt, unsentimental calculation that had kept him alive and employed for 2 decades. Then he put the phone in his pocket without making the call. If Vincent walked into that stadium tomorrow not knowing his mother was sitting in the seat beside him, the seat that was supposed to belong to Chloe, the seat that was supposed to announce to everyone who mattered that a new era had begun, then whatever happened next was not something Danny Rourke had the power or perhaps even the desire to stop. He walked to the hotel bar. He ordered a whiskey he didn't particularly want. He sat with it in front of him and thought about loyalty, what it meant, who it was owed to, how long it lasted once you understood that the person you'd been loyal to had been making calculations about you the same way they made calculations about everything else. The whiskey sat untouched. Outside the hotel windows, New Jersey went about its Saturday night, indifferent and vast, and somewhere across the river, Manhattan blazed against the dark with the particular cold brightness of a city that has seen everything and remembered none of it. Tomorrow, Vincent Moreau was going to walk into the biggest stadium in the northeastern United States believing he had already won. He had no idea that the woman he had spent 7 years underestimating had spent the last 5 days ensuring that every person whose opinion he valued, every relationship he had built his sense of power upon, every carefully maintained illusion of authority and dominance, all of it was going to be waiting for him in that stadium, arranged by hands he had never once thought to fear, ready to come apart in front of an audience of 70,000 people and a social media ecosystem that would carry the footage to every corner of the world before he even made it back to his car. Danny Rourke finally picked up the whiskey. He drank it in one swallow. He set the glass down and looked at his own reflection in the bar mirror. The face of a man who had made his choices and was only now beginning to understand the full weight of what they'd cost him. He thought about calling Vincent one more time. He didn't. The morning of the World Cup final arrived the way bad days always do. Ordinary at first, the light coming in sideways and gray through hotel curtains, the city outside making its regular noises. Nothing in the air to warn you that the architecture of your life was about to be tested in ways you hadn't prepared for. Evelyn was awake at 5:30. Chicago time. She had not slept more than 3 hours, not because she was frightened, but because her mind had been running contingency calculations since midnight with the relentless grinding efficiency of a system that didn't know how to power down. She lay in her own bed, not the penthouse. She had moved out of the penthouse 2 days ago into a suite at a hotel on Michigan Avenue that Vincent had no connection to, and stared at the ceiling and went through the sequence one more time. Margaret had confirmed her attendance at 11 the previous night. A single text, 4 words, "I will be there." Evelyn had read it and felt something move through her chest that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere in the narrow corridor between them. Derek Chu had confirmed the credential transfer. The second VIP seat in the Moreau box was now registered to Margaret Moreau, the access credential tied to a photo ID Derek had received via secure email. Vincent's credential remained unchanged. He would walk in expecting a stage. He would find something else entirely. Diane Voss had confirmed that the divorce filing was served and documented. Vincent's attorneys had been notified. The legal machinery was in motion and would not stop regardless of what happened in New Jersey today. The federal contact, a man whose name Evelyn had never written down anywhere and never would, had confirmed, in the careful, deniable language of someone who understood exactly what they were confirming, that the documentation she had provided was under active review by the appropriate parties. Everything was in place. She got up, made coffee from the in-room machine, stood at the window and looked at Chicago in the early morning dark, and waited for the feeling of certainty that she had expected to arrive by now. The clean, cold certainty of a plan fully executed. It didn't come. What came instead was a memory she hadn't summoned and didn't want. Vincent at the kitchen table in the apartment they'd shared in Lincoln Park in the first year of their marriage, before the penthouse, before the syndicate's expansion into real estate and legitimate hospitality, before she had fully understood what she was building or for whom. He'd been reading something, and he'd looked up when she walked in and smiled at her with the unguarded, uncalculated warmth of a man who had not yet learned to weaponize his own charm. She had stood in the kitchen doorway in an oversized sweater and thought, "This is the one. This is the person I will spend my life with." She had been wrong about so many things. She drank her coffee. She got dressed. She had a plane to catch. She landed at Newark at 10:47. A car was waiting, arranged through a service that had no connection to anyone in Vincent's world. The driver didn't speak. That was fine. She didn't need conversation. She needed the 45 minutes between the airport and the stadium to finish becoming the version of herself that today required. The version that didn't remember the kitchen table in Lincoln Park. The version that had only the plan and the documentation and the forward momentum of 7 years of grievances arriving at their logical conclusion. She got out of the car at the stadium's administrative entrance and walked inside. The thing about MetLife Stadium on World Cup final day was the scale of it. 72,000 people producing a noise that wasn't quite sound anymore, but something more physical. A pressure in the chest, a vibration in the sternum, the whole building alive with it in a way that made individual human problems feel temporarily absurd. Evelyn had been in large venues her entire professional life. She had managed events at stadiums and arenas and convention centers that held tens of thousands of people, and she had learned long ago that large crowds do not make you feel small. They make you feel irrelevant, which is a different thing entirely and sometimes exactly what you need. She found Margaret at the agreed location, a hospitality corridor 2 levels above the main concourse, quiet by stadium standards, the crowd noise muffled to a low roar. Margaret was standing with her back to the wall and her hands folded in front of her in the way she always stood when she was composed but coiled, a stillness that Evelyn had learned to read over 7 years as the external expression of an interior state that was working very hard. She was dressed simply. Dark jacket, dark slacks, silver at her ears. She looked like what she was, a woman of 67 who had spent 4 decades in proximity to power and had absorbed its grammar without being softened by it. They looked at each other. "You came," Evelyn said. "I told you I would." Margaret's voice was even. "I don't say things I don't mean." Unlike your son, hung between them, unspoken. Evelyn handed her the access credential, a laminated pass on a lanyard, her name printed clearly. "The seat is directly beside his reserved spot. He won't see you until he sits down. The arrangement of the box means you'll be visible to him before he can redirect or leave without making a scene." Margaret took the pass. She looked at it for a moment. "And the materials?" Evelyn opened the leather portfolio she carried and removed a sealed folder. Hotel receipts, surveillance photographs, bank transfer records, and a digital audio file on this. She placed a small device, a thin rectangular player the size of a credit card, on top of the folder. "The recording you already heard. Press the single button. The speaker is directional. It will be audible to anyone seated within 6 feet. Margaret took the folder. She held it without opening it. Her hands, Evelyn noticed, were completely steady. "He's going to be angry," Margaret said. "Yes." "He's going to feel humiliated." "Yes." "And you're certain this is how it needs to happen? In public? In front of—" "He chose the venue," Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge inside the quiet that Margaret heard and recognized. "He chose to use this stadium, these seats, this event as the stage for his announcement. I didn't choose the public. He did. I'm just attending the event I paid for." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the clean finality of a woman who had made her decision 3 days ago and was not revisiting it. "I'll be in my seat," she said. She walked away down the corridor, straight-backed, unhurried, the folder under her arm, and Evelyn watched her go and felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of a plan that has been theoretical for weeks, becoming suddenly, irreversibly real. She found her own position, not in the VIP box, but in a hospitality suite 2 sections removed that had a sightline to the box entrance. She settled in. She ordered water she didn't drink. She watched the clock. The match kicked off at 4:30. Vincent would arrive between 4 and 4:15. He was always punctual at high-visibility events. It was one of the things she knew about him with the intimacy of 7 years of close observation. She checked her phone. No messages from Danny, no messages from Gerald Pruitt, nothing from Vincent, which was not surprising. The divorce filing would have been delivered to Gerald, not to Vincent directly, and Vincent's response to receiving catastrophic news was to go quiet and lateral, talking to his lawyers and his operations chief before he talked to anyone else. Or so she had assumed. At 3:47, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. Mrs. Moreau. The voice was male, mid-range, carefully neutral in the way of someone reading from a prepared emotional script. Sterling, she said automatically. Who is this? Someone who thought you should know something before the next hour happens. Her spine went rigid. She kept her voice even. Know what? The transfers you flagged, the ones running through your structure without your authorization. A pause measured to produce maximum effect, and it worked, because Evelyn felt something cold move through her stomach. They weren't Vincent's. The noise of the stadium seemed to drop by half. Explain that. The account they ran into. The one registered under the name you didn't recognize. Another pause. Run the name through the Illinois Secretary of State's business registry. Corporate registration. 3 years ago. The line went dead. Evelyn sat completely still for 4 seconds. Then she opened her browser, navigated to the Illinois Secretary of State's business registry, and typed in the name from Marcus Harmon's file, the name on the receiving account of those unauthorized transfers. The name she had assumed was a shell constructed by Vincent or someone operating on his instructions. The registry returned a result in under 3 seconds. She read it. Then she read it again. The registered agent of the entity was listed as a law firm she didn't recognize. The principal officer was listed as a name she did recognize. A name she knew with the specific physical familiarity of someone you've worked beside for years. Someone whose professional habits and communication patterns and decision-making framework you know as well as your own. Gerald Pruitt. Not Vincent's shell. Gerald's. She sat with that for a moment. Her mind was already running the implications with the cold, mechanical speed it defaulted to under pressure, and the implications were unraveling something she had believed to be solid. Gerald had been running money through her architecture without Vincent's knowledge, or with Vincent's knowledge and without her. Either way, the transfers she had handed to her federal contact as evidence of Vincent's financial misconduct were not Vincent's financial misconduct. They were Gerald's, and she had just handed a federal investigator documentation that, without the full context, implicated the structure she had built, her structure, an activity that she had not authorized and could not now cleanly separate from her own fingerprints on the underlying architecture. She had made an error. In 7 years of managing the Moreau Syndicate's legitimate operations, she had not made a single material error. She had built the system to be error-resistant precisely because she understood that in the world she was operating in, errors did not produce correction. They produced catastrophe. She had made an error. She stood up, sat back down, made herself breathe. Think. Think it through the way you always think it through, from the point of failure backward to the place where the chain can be reattached. She called Marcus Harmon. He picked up in 2 rings. I was wondering when you'd call. The account, she said. The receiving account for the transfers. Did you trace the beneficial ownership fully? A pause that was slightly too long. I traced it to the registered entity. Did you trace it past the registered entity? Another pause. The beneficial ownership layer is, it's been structured carefully. I got to the registered agent and I had what I thought you needed. You didn't go deeper. Evelyn? He hadn't called her that before. Always Mrs. Moreau. The use of her first name was its own kind of information. I was working a compressed timeline with the parameters you gave me. You said you needed documentation of transfers running through the Moreau structure. That's what I need you to tell me right now, Marcus. definitively. Is there any evidentiary path that connects those transfers to Vincent Moreau directly? A long pause. The kind that answers the question before the words do. No, he said. There isn't. She ended the call. The cold in her stomach had spread. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes for a moment and breathed through her nose and let her mind do what it did, even when what it was doing felt like watching a building she had designed collapse in real time. She had given the federal contact documentation pointing to financial crimes embedded in her architecture. Without a direct evidentiary link to Vincent, the investigation that followed would excavate the structure itself, her structure. Every decision she had made over 7 years, every financial instrument she had designed, every transfer she had authorized would be examined by people whose job was to find wrongdoing, and who would bring to that examination none of the context, none of the intent, none of the 7 years of careful separation she had built to protect herself. She had handed them the building and forgotten to give them the architectural drawings. She needed to call her federal contact. She needed to call Diane Voss. She needed to do both of those things in the next 20 minutes before this particular door closed any further. She was reaching for her phone when the second thing happened. A text from a number she recognized as Derek Chu's assistant at MetLife Stadium. Ms. Sterling, there's been a credential issue with the second seat in the Moreau VIP box. The original access pass was reactivated by the primary reservation holder approximately 40 minutes ago. We're showing 2 valid credentials for that seat. I need guidance on how to proceed. She read it twice. Then she understood. Vincent had been tipped off. Someone, Danny, Gerald, someone inside the stadium's sports entertainment contacts, someone in the chain she had not fully accounted for, had told Vincent about the credential change. And Vincent, with the instinctive territorial aggression of a man who controlled access as a form of power, had immediately contacted the stadium's VIP services and reactivated the original credential for the second seat, which meant that Margaret Moreau's access pass was now in conflict with a reactivated original, which meant that when Margaret arrived at the box entrance with her credential, she would be flagged, which meant that Vincent was not walking into an ambush. He knew something was wrong. He didn't know the full shape of it. If he had known about Margaret specifically, he would not have simply reactivated a credential. He would have called his mother, and the call would have changed everything. He knew enough to be defensive. He didn't know enough to understand what was actually waiting for him. But the window was closing. Evelyn was on her feet and moving before she had consciously decided to move, the phone at her ear, calling Derek Chu directly. He picked up in one ring. Derek? Listen to me carefully. The credential conflict, do not resolve it through standard protocol. Flag it as a system error and hold both passes as valid pending manual review. Can you do that? Evelyn, our VIP services team has already been contacted by... I know who contacted them. Can you hold it? A pause. I can buy you maybe 30 minutes before my supervisor gets involved. That's enough. Hold it. She hung up and turned and found herself face to face with a man she had not seen coming down the hospitality corridor. He was standing 6 feet away, hands in his jacket pockets, watching her with the dirty ice eyes and the cinder-block jaw, and the specific expression of a man who had spent the last 18 hours deciding something. Danny Rourke. They looked at each other across 6 feet of corridor carpet, while the stadium roared around them like something alive. How long have you been standing there? She said. Long enough. He didn't move. Gerald's dirty. You know that now. Yes. Vincent doesn't. He paused. Or he didn't, until Gerald called him this morning and told him that the federal documentation you provided points to the transfers. Gerald told him you've tried to implicate him in transactions he didn't authorize. Gerald told him you're trying to bury him. The cold in her stomach became something more specific and more dangerous. Gerald told him I'm the one running the unauthorized transfers. Gerald told him you've been siphoning from the legitimate holdings and building a case to cover it. Danny's voice was flat, carrying the information the way he carried everything. Without visible affect, the emotional content entirely submerged. Vincent believes it, or he's chosen to believe it, which for practical purposes is the same thing. That's insane. The documentation you built, Danny said, with your fingerprints on the architecture. Gerald's had 11 years to learn how you build things. He built this to look like you. He paused. He's been planning his exit from the Moreau organization for longer than you've been planning yours. He just needed someone else's war to hide his retreat in. Evelyn stood there. The stadium noise was a physical thing, pressing against the walls of the corridor, and she felt suddenly and completely the weight of what she was standing inside. Not just the plan she had constructed, not just the marriage she was dismantling, but the full 7-year architecture of a life built inside a world that had been lying to her with the same patient thoroughness with which she had been lying to herself. "Vincent thinks I'm the one who went to the feds," she said. "Yes. And he thinks the financial crimes they're going to find are mine." That's what Gerald told him. "And Gerald is currently on a flight to Zurich," Danny said. "Left Newark an hour ago." The silence between them lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt longer. "Why are you telling me this?" Evelyn said. Danny looked at her for a moment with those dirty ice eyes. He looked tired in a way that went past the physical. The tiredness of a man who has been carrying something corrosive for a long time and has finally decided that the weight of it is no longer survivable. "Because in 22 years," he said, "I've watched Vincent make a lot of decisions, good ones and bad ones. But this is the first time I've watched him choose to believe something this convenient over something this obvious." He paused. "You didn't steal from him. I know what that looks like. I've seen it. This isn't it." Another pause, longer. "And Gerald Pruitt has been the one consistent presence in every financial decision I've questioned for the last 3 years." "You knew," Evelyn said. Not an accusation, a recognition. "I suspected." His jaw tightened. "Suspicion isn't the same as knowing, and in this organization you don't bring suspicion to the table. So you did nothing." "I'm doing something now." She looked at him. Outside, the crowd noise surged as something happened on the pitch. A near miss or a foul, something that sent 70,000 people to their feet for a moment, and then settled back into the sustained rolling pressure of a crowd waiting for something decisive. "What Vincent believes," she said slowly, "changes the calculation inside the box. If he goes in there thinking I've stolen from him and implicated him with federal investigators, he's not walking into an ambush. He's walking in ready to be the one who... He's not going to do anything in front of 70,000 people," Danny said. "He's angry, not stupid." "But Margaret's credential has been flagged. Vincent knows there's a second pass on the seat. He doesn't know it's his mother. He thinks it's someone you placed." Danny pulled his hand from his jacket pocket. He was holding a phone. On the screen was a text exchange. Vincent's name at the top. She read the most recent message. "If anyone tries to access that seat who isn't Chloe, have security handle it quietly. I don't care who it is." Evelyn read it twice. Margaret Moreau was going to arrive at the VIP box entrance with a credential that the primary reservation holder had flagged for security removal. The box staff, following Vincent's instructions, would stop her. Margaret, dignified, straight-backed, 67 years old, would be turned away from the seat her son had indirectly used to announce her daughter-in-law's replacement by security personnel acting on her own son's instructions. The folder with the documentation would stay closed. The recording would never play. The ambush would dissolve before it began, and Evelyn would be standing 2 sections away with a federal investigation pointed at her own architectural fingerprints and a husband who had been told by his trusted attorney of 11 years that she was the one who had betrayed him. She felt it then. Not panic. She hadn't panicked since she was 22 years old and had learned in a single bad professional crisis that panic was simply fear with bad time management. But something close to it. She had 30 minutes and the plan was gone, and Danny Rourke was standing in front of her, and the crowd outside was 58,000 people who did not care about any of this, and Evelyn Sterling did the thing she had always done when the architecture collapsed. She stopped looking at what was broken and started looking at what was still standing. What was still standing? Margaret was inside that box. The folder was in her hands. The audio player was in her jacket pocket. Vincent did not yet know his mother was sitting in the seat beside his. He knew the credential had been changed. He did not know to whom. That gap, the distance between what Vincent suspected and what Vincent actually knew, was the last functional piece of the original plan. It was narrow. It was closing. But it was there. How did he find out about the credential change? She said to Danny. Sports entertainment contact. Someone in VIP services flagged it as unusual, and it moved up the chain to someone who knows Vincent's people. Not Gerald. Gerald's been dark since this morning. This was operational, not legal. She processed that. So Vincent knows the second credential was changed, but he doesn't know it was Margaret. Correct. And he's instructed box security to remove anyone who isn't Chloe. Yes? But Chloe isn't here. Danny looked at her steadily. No, she isn't. Evelyn felt something click into alignment. Not the elegant, pre-planned alignment of a strategy executing cleanly, but the rougher, more improvised alignment of someone who has stopped trying to execute the original plan and started trying to win the actual situation. These were not always the same thing. She had learned that today. I need to get to that box entrance before Vincent does, she said. He's already on the premium level. Then I need to get there now. She was moving before she finished the sentence, and Danny, after a single beat that she understood as him making a decision he would not walk back from, was moving with her. Cuts out. The premium level corridor of MetLife Stadium on World Cup final day was not built for urgency. It was built for the leisurely movement of high net worth individuals who had paid for the experience of arriving without friction, of never feeling crowded or rushed, of existing inside an event at a level of remove that insulated them from the animal press of the general admission floors below. The carpet was thick. The lighting was warm. The crowd was sparse enough that two people moving at speed were conspicuous. Evelyn moved at speed anyway. She had the portfolio in one hand and her phone in the other, and she was already dialing Derek Chu as she walked, her heels loud on the carpet despite its thickness, her heart doing something her chest was having trouble accommodating. Derek picked up in one ring. Evelyn, the situation with the... Derek, listen, the security staff at the Moreau box, the instructions they received from the primary reservation holder. Can you countermand those instructions directly from VIP services? A pause. I can, but it'll create a formal conflict of authorization that goes into the event incident log. I need you to do it, right now. Call them directly and tell them the second credential stands and no guest is to be removed from that seating allocation regardless of instructions from the reservation holder. Evelyn, if the reservation holder complains to the stadium authority, Derek... She stopped walking for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to put everything into her voice that the situation required. You owe me a favor. You said so yourself. I'm calling it. Silence. Then, give me 2 minutes. She kept walking. Danny was half a step behind her, saying nothing, which she appreciated. She did not need conversation right now. She needed corridor, and she needed time, and she needed Derek Chu to move faster than he typically moved. The box entrance came into view 60 meters ahead. 2 security staff, white polos, earpieces, and Margaret, standing 6 feet from the entrance, credential in hand, folder under her arm, back straight, doing what Margaret did, waiting with the composure of someone who has outlasted harder things than a credential dispute at a football stadium. Evelyn's phone buzzed. A text from Derek. Done. They've been told second credential is confirmed by VIP Director Override. No removal. She exhaled through her nose. One problem closed. The next one was walking toward the box entrance from the far end of the corridor. Vincent. He was 60 meters away on the opposite side, coming from the elevator bank, moving with the deliberate pace she recognized, shoulders set, face controlled, the physical grammar of a man who had decided something and was implementing it. He was alone. No Chloe, no security of his own, which meant he had come to handle this personally and quietly, which was both better and worse than the alternative. He hadn't seen her yet. He hadn't seen Margaret. The box entrance was equidistant between them. Evelyn had perhaps 45 seconds before he reached the security staff and found out that his instructions had been countermanded. She covered the distance in 30. She reached Margaret the same moment the security staff registered her approach and the change in the situation's energy. One of them, the taller one, the same one who had questioned her earlier, looked at her with the expression of someone who had been through 3 management-level changes of instruction in the last 15 minutes and was exhausted by all of them. The override came through from VIP services, he confirmed, without being asked. Second credential stands. Thank you, Evelyn said. She turned to Margaret. He's coming from the east corridor. You have maybe 30 seconds before he sees you. Margaret looked past her down the corridor. Her face did something very small and very controlled. A compression around the eyes, a slight setting of the jaw, the minimum external expression of what was moving through her internally. Then it stilled again. Good, Margaret said. I'd rather he see me outside than be surprised inside. Margaret, I know my son. She was already turning to face the direction Evelyn had indicated. Let me handle this part. There was no time to argue. And arguing with Margaret Moreau on a point of strategy involving her own son was not something Evelyn had ever managed to win. She stepped back. She positioned herself beside the box entrance in the space between the doorframe and the security station, not hidden. There was nowhere to hide on this corridor. But not the first thing Vincent's eyes would find when they found the situation. Danny stepped back further. He put 6 feet of carpet between himself and everything that was about to happen, crossed his arms, and became a wall. Vincent reached the edge of the security station and stopped. He had seen Margaret. The corridor went quiet in the specific way places go quiet when something is about to happen that the physical environment itself seems to recognize. The crowd noise from the stadium pressed against the walls from outside, muffled and enormous. And inside this corridor there was the carpet and the warm light, and the 2 security staff doing their collective best to become invisible, and Vincent Moreau standing 8 feet from his mother, holding a folder that he could not yet see the contents of. His face did what Evelyn had watched it do twice today. Ran through several things in quick succession, surprise giving way to calculation, giving way to something she didn't have a name for, the thing underneath the professional exterior when the exterior runs out of instructions. Mom. His voice was careful. What are you doing here? Waiting for you, Margaret said. Her voice was completely level. The way I've been waiting for you to become the person I raised you to be for the last several years. He looked at the folder. Who brought you into this? No one brought me into anything. I walked in. She held his gaze. I've been walking toward this conversation for longer than you know, Vincent. I just needed someone to open the door. His eyes moved. Found Evelyn. The look he gave her was complicated. She could see the day in it, the full weight of everything that had happened since 9:14 that morning, the Gerald situation and the federal contact and the phone call and the choice he'd made to send the documentation, and underneath all of that, older and heavier, the 7 years of a marriage that was now legally concluded and what it meant to stand in a stadium corridor in New Jersey and see the woman he had married standing beside his mother with matching expressions of people who have decided. This is between me and Evelyn, he said to Margaret, not you. It stopped being only between you and Evelyn when you decided to use those seats to announce a new queen, Margaret said. You made it about the family, about what the family is. I have a vote in that conversation. His jaw tightened. You had no right to... I have every right. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of it came from somewhere below volume, from the accumulated authority of 67 years and 4 decades of watching this organization run, and the very specific moral credibility of a woman who has finally stopped excusing something she should have called out years ago. I have the right of a mother who watched her son take everything this woman built and treat it like it was always his. I have the right of someone who sat across from Evelyn in my kitchen and listened to your own voice tell another woman that my daughter-in-law was the background. That was my voice too, Vincent. Every time I said nothing. The corridor was very quiet. Vincent's breathing had changed. She could see it from where she stood. The rise and fall of his chest, slightly faster, slightly shallower. The respiration of a man who is managing something at the outer edge of what he can manage. You want to do this here, he said, in a corridor, on a stadium level. You chose the venue, Evelyn said. His eyes came back to her, sharp. I chose it for something else. Yes, she said. You chose it to make an announcement. I'm suggesting you consider what announcement you actually want to make today. A silence. From outside the glass of the corridor wall, the stadium erupted. A massive surge, the crowd rising as one to something happening on the pitch, the noise building to a peak and holding there, pressing against the building from every direction, and the 3 of them stood in it like people standing in a storm that hasn't quite broken. Then Vincent said, "What's in the folder?" Margaret opened it. She did not hand it to him. She held it open and let him come to it, which meant he had to take 2 steps toward her, which meant he had to choose to move rather than having the information brought to him. A small thing that was not small. He looked at the bank transfer records first. He would have, because Vincent always went to the numbers before he went to the evidence, a financial animal by instinct regardless of everything else. She watched his eyes move across the page, watched them stop. Gerald's entity, he said, flatly. Yes. These are from 14 months ago. The earliest ones, yes. He turned the page. The hotel receipts. He looked at those differently. She could see the difference in how he held the folder, the slight change in the angle of his shoulders. The financial records had produced calculation. The hotel receipts produced something older and more physical. He didn't look at the photographs. He closed the folder before he got to them. I've already sent the documentation to the federal investigators, he said. His voice was under very tight control. The beneficial ownership chain, Gerald's account structure, everything my operations team had. I know, Evelyn said. Weiss confirmed it. Something moved across his face. You've been in contact with Weiss directly. I initiated the original contact, yes, and you didn't tell me. I didn't tell you a lot of things, she said, the same way you didn't tell me a lot of things. We got very good at that. He looked at her for a long moment. The controlled expression had developed over the course of this conversation, a kind of porousness. The professional face still there, but no longer quite sufficient to contain what was moving behind it. She recognized it. She had spent 7 years learning to read his face the way you learn to read the faces of people you live with. Involuntarily, comprehensively, with an accuracy that doesn't require effort and doesn't go away. The settlement terms, he said. Diane Voss's terms. Yes. The legitimate holdings. Everything I built. My consulting equity, the hospitality subsidiaries I restructured, the event company's stake, my work. That's all I want. He was quiet. She could see him running numbers, not the emotional accounting, the financial accounting, the actual structural impact of the settlement terms on what remained of the Morrow organization after Gerald's theft and the federal investigation and the audit exposure that was coming regardless of how cooperatively the documentation had been provided. It's fair, Danny said from behind her. Both of them looked at him. He hadn't moved from his position, arms still crossed, expression neutral, the particular neutrality of someone who has made a decision about where he stands and is not ambivalent about it. It's fair, he said again. She built it. You know she built it. The terms Voss filed are what she's entitled to and less than she could have claimed. A beat. Gerald took more than that from you in 14 months, and you gave him 11 years of trust. I'd consider the comparison. Vincent looked at Danny for a long moment. Something passed between them. The compressed communication of 2 men who have known each other for more than 2 decades and have developed a language for it that doesn't require words. Evelyn had seen it before. She had always found it slightly impenetrable and had learned not to try. Whatever passed between them, when it was done, Vincent's shoulders had changed, not broken. She had not come here to break him, and she had not. He was still standing with the same physical authority, the same fundamental density of presence that had defined him since she'd met him. But something had settled differently, some load redistributed. He looked at his mother. Margaret was watching him with the brown eyes that had watched him his entire life. Not soft, exactly. Not the sentimental gaze of maternal indulgence, but attentive. The look of a woman who sees her child clearly, without the convenient distortions of pride or defensiveness, and loves him anyway, and holds him accountable anyway, and understands that both of those things are possible simultaneously, and that doing only one of them is not actually love. I need to make calls, he said. Yes, Margaret said. You do? He looked at Evelyn one more time. The look lasted several seconds. She held it without flinching and without softening, because she was done performing both flinching and softening, and because whatever this look was, apology, recognition, the particular grief of a man who understands too late what he had, it was his to carry, not hers to manage. My attorneys will contact Voss, he said, this week. Good, she said. He stood there one more moment. Then he put the folder under his arm and turned and walked back down the corridor toward the elevator bank, moving with the same deliberate pace he'd come with, but carrying it differently. The pace of someone who is walking toward something instead of away from something, even if what he's walking toward is difficult, and the difficulty is entirely his own making. Evelyn watched him go. Her hands were shaking. She realized it only now. The fine, controlled tremor in both hands that had been happening, probably, for the last 30 minutes, and that she had not permitted herself to notice because noticing it would have taken resources she needed for other things. She pressed them flat against her thighs, breathed through her nose, let the shaking be what it was. Danny walked up beside her. He didn't say anything. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked at the corridor where Vincent had been. "What will you do?" she asked him. He considered it. "I have options. Some of them are even legal." A pause. "I've been with that organization for 22 years. I know where every piece of it is. The parts that are clean are still worth something. And the parts that aren't. I won't be involved in those," he said. "Not anymore." She looked at him sideways. "Was that always true?" A silence. "No," he said. "It wasn't always true." She nodded. She didn't have anything to add to that. She understood the journey from complicity to decision better than she would have liked to. "The text this morning," she said. "The one you sent me. The seating chart with Margaret's name." He looked at her. "Yes." "That was the moment you decided." He thought about it. "That was the moment I admitted I'd already decided." She nodded again. Margaret appeared at her shoulder, coat over her arm, the empty folder held at her side. The audio player had never needed to come out of her pocket. The recording had never needed to play. "Shall we go in?" Margaret said. "The match is in the 61st minute." Evelyn looked at her. "You want to watch the match?" "I paid for the seat," Margaret said, with the perfectly composed expression of a woman who has just navigated one of the most difficult confrontations of her adult life and is now ready for something completely else. "I intend to use it." Evelyn looked at the box entrance. At the door? At the two security staff who had witnessed the entire corridor sequence with the professional blankness of people who were going to process this privately and not speak of it publicly, which was all you could ask. She looked back at Margaret. "Yes," she said. "All right." They walked in. The box was exactly as she'd described to Margaret 2 days ago. 12 seats, 2 rows, the floor-to-ceiling glass opening onto the pitch below where 60-something thousand people were watching 2 national teams contest something that would matter to them and their children and have its own life and history, independent of everything happening in this building's private rooms. The afternoon light had shifted since she'd last been in here, coming in at a lower angle now, golden and slightly hazy, the way World Cup final afternoon light is supposed to look and almost never does. She sat in the first seat. Margaret sat in the second. They watched the match. Her hands stopped shaking somewhere in the 67th minute, during a sustained passage of play that required nothing of her. No calculation, no navigation, no management of anyone's reality but her own. And she noticed the stillness in her hands and let herself feel it, and watched the players move on the bright grass below and breathed. Just breathed. At the back of her mind, something was already moving. The next thing. The company she was going to build, the work she was going to do, the specific productive grief of dismantling one life and understanding with increasing clarity the shape of the next one, not as consolation, not as replacement, but as the thing that was always there, waiting, patient and real, behind the years of building someone else's kingdom. She would deal with Weiss on Tuesday. She would call Diane Voss on Wednesday. She would begin the actual work of the next chapter with the same methodical, unromanticized competence she brought to every project she had ever undertaken. But that was Tuesday. That was Wednesday. Right now, there was the match and the golden light, and Margaret Moreau sitting in the seat beside her. And somewhere in this building, Carl Weiss was doing whatever federal agents do after they've located the people they came looking for. And somewhere in a Lufthansa business class seat, Gerald Pruitt was drinking something expensive and believing he had escaped, which was a belief he would hold for exactly as long as it took the plane to land, and the 2 European officers to be waiting at the gate. And somewhere on the elevator bank down the corridor, Vincent Moreau was riding down to the concourse level with a folder under his arm and 22 years of an organization's weight on his shoulders, and the first hours of a future that was going to look significantly different from the past. The crowd rose. A goal. The real thing this time. The stadium detonating, 60-something thousand people in a single eruption, the sound breaking over the building like something physical, the glass of the box vibrating in its frame. And Evelyn felt it move through her chest the way genuine crowd noise always does. Past the ribs, past the careful management, down into something animal and immediate and entirely present. She gripped the armrest. She felt her pulse in her hands. She was here. She was in this seat. She had paid for it, and she was sitting in it. And the match was in the 71st minute, and she was alive, and the plan was broken, and the outcome was real, and nothing about it was clean, and none of that mattered right now, because right now there was only this room and this light, and the woman sitting beside her and the work that was waiting on the other side of today. The crowd noise held and finally, slowly, began to come down. Margaret reached over without looking at her and put her hand briefly on Evelyn's, the way a woman touches another woman's hand when words are not the right instrument, when the only thing that fits is the plain physical acknowledgement of presence. Then she took her hand back and watched the match. Evelyn looked at the pitch below where the players were resetting, taking their positions, the world beginning again from a fixed point the way it always does after something decisive. And she held the armrest and felt her pulse slow and thought, not yet the end, but close. The door at the back of the box opened and Evelyn turned and Agent Carl Weiss stepped through it with two men behind him, and he looked at her across the room with the careful, measuring expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and needs to confirm what he's looking at before he proceeds. His name was Agent Carl Weiss, and he had the particular quality of stillness that Evelyn had noticed the first time she'd heard his voice on the phone 3 weeks ago. The stillness of someone who has learned, through years of walking into rooms where people are lying, and rooms where people are terrified, and rooms where people are both simultaneously, that stillness is its own form of pressure. He didn't need to fill a room with noise or movement. He just needed to be present in it, and let the room do the rest. He stood inside the box entrance, and he looked at Evelyn, and he took in Margaret beside her, and the empty folder on the seat back, and the golden afternoon light coming through the glass, and the World Cup final playing 70 feet below them, with the sustained roar of 60-something thousand people who had no idea what was happening in this small, insulated room. He looked at her and said, "Ms. Sterling, I apologize for the location." "Don't," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Is he in the building?" Weiss crossed the room to where she was sitting. He did not sit down himself. He stood with his hands at his sides and spoke in the low, precise register of someone delivering information that has weight and knows it. Gerald Pruitt's flight was flagged at Newark before departure. The airline was contacted under emergency authority. He did not board. She heard that. She processed what it meant. Gerald, still in the country, still reachable, the evidence chain still intact and closable in a way that would have been impossible once he cleared European airspace. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was clenched. "Where is he now?" she said. "In federal custody as of approximately 1 hour ago. He was apprehended at the airport while attempting to rebook on a connecting flight through Toronto." Weiss paused. "The documentation Mr. Moreau's operations team provided this afternoon was sufficient to support an immediate detention order. The beneficial ownership chain is clear. Mr. Pruitt's connection to the receiving accounts is documented at multiple levels." She looked at him. "And the investigation into the structure itself, my architecture, is being reframed accordingly." He said it without apology and without excessive reassurance, in the tone of someone conveying a bureaucratic fact rather than offering comfort. "The forensic accountants will need access to your records directly, not as a subject of investigation, as a material witness and cooperative source. There's a distinction, and it matters legally. I'll have Diane Voss coordinate the access. That's appropriate." He looked at Margaret briefly, with the neutral professional acknowledgement of someone recognizing the presence of a person they had not expected and choosing not to address it. Then he looked back at Evelyn. "There's one more thing." She waited. "Mr. Moreau is currently being interviewed on the concourse level, voluntarily. His attorney is not present because his attorney is the person currently in our custody, which creates a complication he elected to manage by speaking to our agents directly rather than waiting." A beat. "He's being cooperative, more cooperative than I anticipated, frankly." Evelyn looked at him. "What is he telling them?" "Everything." Weiss said it simply. "He's telling them everything he knows about the transfers, the account structure, the relationship between Pruitt and the subsidiary CFOs who process the transactions. He appears to have a comprehensive grasp of his own organization's financial operations, which is useful. Another beat. He also appears to be under no illusion about the position he's in, which makes the conversation more efficient than these conversations usually are. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the crowd noise surged again, the match in its final quarter, the tension ratcheting in the way it does when time is running out, and the score is close and everyone in the stadium is leaning forward simultaneously. She felt it through the glass, the physical pressure of collective human urgency, and found it briefly and absurdly comforting. The reminder that the world was larger than this room and was mostly concerned with other things. "Will he face charges?" she said. Weiss considered the question with the deliberate care of someone who understands the difference between what they know and what they're permitted to say. That depends on the full scope of what's uncovered and the degree of cooperation going forward. I can't speak to outcome. I can tell you that the posture he's currently taking is the correct one, from a purely strategic standpoint. He paused. I'd also say this, whatever you provided us, Ms. Sterling, and however the evidentiary chain got complicated along the way, the core material was solid. The structure you built was clean. The contamination was Pruitt's, and the investigation will reflect that. She nodded once. It was all she could manage in that moment, without the careful composure she'd been maintaining all day, developing a crack she wasn't ready for. Weiss reached into his jacket and placed a business card on the armrest beside her. Not the same card as before, a different one, with a direct line she hadn't had. "Tuesday," he said. "My office. Bring Voss, then." "I will." He looked at her for one more moment, the assessing, unreadable look of a man whose professional life consists of reading people accurately and who has, she suspected, formed a view of her that she would probably never have confirmed. Then he nodded, once, to both of them, and turned and walked back to the box entrance and through it, and the two men who had come in with him followed, and the door closed, and they were alone again. The stadium roared. Evelyn sat in the seat with her hands in her lap, and looked at the pitch below and breathed through her nose and let the roar come through the glass and move through her chest, and tried to locate, somewhere in the complicated interior landscape of the last 18 hours, something that felt like solid ground. Margaret reached over and placed her hand briefly on Evelyn's. Not a pat, not a squeeze, just the plain, warm weight of another person's hand saying, "I am here. I see you. You are not alone in this room." Then she took her hand back and watched the match, because Margaret Moreau was a woman who understood the difference between the moment for comfort and the moment for allowing someone to be quietly inside their own experience, and she had always known which was which. Evelyn watched the match. She didn't know who was playing, and she didn't care who won, and none of that mattered. At all. What mattered was the light through the glass and the crowd noise, and the simple biological fact of being present in a moment after everything the moment had cost to reach. The match ended 12 minutes later. She didn't register the final score. She registered the eruption, the full total detonation of 60-something thousand people at the decisive moment, the kind of noise that doesn't feel like noise anymore, but like weather, like a physical system moving through the world, and she sat in it and felt her pulse in her throat and did not cry, which surprised her slightly and then did not surprise her, because she had not cried once in the 5 days she'd spent building this. And she understood now that whatever this experience was going to require from her emotionally, it was going to require it later, in private, in the ordinary moments of the days ahead, when the adrenaline had finally metabolized and the body was left alone with what the mind had been too busy to feel. Later. There would be time for later. Right now she stood, picked up her portfolio, and walked out of the VIP box at MetLife Stadium with Margaret Moreau beside her, and neither of them looked back. The drive back to Newark Airport took 40 minutes through the post-match dispersal traffic. The highway choked with the particular cheerful gridlock of a major sporting event releasing its crowd into the world. Evelyn sat in the back of the car and looked out the window at the New Jersey landscape and said nothing. And her driver, a man who had worked with her corporate contacts for 3 years and understood that silence in the back seat was not an invitation for conversation, said nothing either. She checked her phone. 14 messages. Diane Voss. 3 times. her operations contact at the financial services firm managing the protected trust, twice. A number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a journalist from a Chicago Tribune subsidiary who had, somehow already, gotten wind of a federal action connected to the Moreau organization's legitimate business holdings and wanted a comment. She forwarded that one to Diane without reading it twice. She called Diane from the car. Diane picked up in one ring, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant she already knew most of it. "Gerald Pruitt is in federal custody," Evelyn said. "I heard," Diane said. "My contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office confirmed 20 minutes ago. How are you?" "Functional. Good enough." Diane's voice had the efficient warmth of a professional who cared about her clients in the specific way of someone whose care expressed itself through competence rather than sentiment. "Weiss wants you Tuesday." "I told him yes, I'll need you there." "Already blocked." A pause. "The settlement. Vincent's attorneys called 40 minutes ago." Evelyn's hand tightened on the phone. "And? They want to talk. Not contest. Talk." There was a specific phrase used, which I'll paraphrase as, "We've been instructed to find a resolution," which, in my experience, means the primary party has told them to settle and settle cleanly and not make it worse. Another pause. "Evelyn, I think you're going to get everything you asked for." She looked out the window at the New Jersey highway moving past and let that land. Not with triumph. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the end of a very long physical effort. The moment after you've been holding something heavy for so long that you've forgotten your arms could feel any other way, and you set it down, and what you feel first is not relief but the strange, disorienting absence of the weight. "Set the meeting for Thursday," she said. "Not before. I need 2 days." "Thursday," Diane confirmed. "Get some sleep." She ended the call and put the phone in her portfolio and went back to looking out the window. The traffic inched. The driver put on something instrumental and low that she didn't recognize, and which was exactly right for the particular quality of exhaustion she was carrying, the kind that lives not in the muscles but somewhere deeper, in the place where sustained vigilance lives when it finally stands down. She thought about Gerald Pruitt in federal custody at Newark Airport. She thought about the 11 years he had spent inside Vincent's organization, learning the architecture she had built, patient and meticulous, and she tried to locate what she felt about him and found it was less than she expected. Not forgiveness. She was not interested in the performance of forgiveness, had never understood it as something you decided to do rather than something that happened or didn't over time. Just a kind of cold, factual assessment. He had been a man who saw an opportunity and took it and built his escape route inside someone else's war, and was now going to spend a significant portion of his remaining years dealing with the consequences. That was the full accounting. There wasn't more to feel about it. She thought about Danny Rourke, still somewhere in that stadium or its parking structures, making his own calculations about the next chapter of his life. She thought about what he'd said. "I won't be involved in those parts. Not anymore." She believed him, and she understood that believing him was not the same as knowing what he would do with that intention, and that his future was his to navigate and not something she owed any more thought. She thought about Chloe Bennett, who was almost certainly in a hotel room in New Jersey right now, or possibly already on a flight back to Chicago, and who had come into this story as a villain and turned out to be something more ordinary and more sad. A 26-year-old woman who had been shown a door that looked like an opportunity and walked through it without understanding what it was actually attached to. Evelyn found she had nothing particular to feel about Chloe either. Just the mild, impersonal wish that she would find something real and understand the difference between real and useful before she spent another decade learning it the hard way. The traffic cleared as they approached the airport interchange. The car accelerated. The city fell away behind them. She was back in Chicago by 10:30 that night. She didn't go to the hotel. She drove instead to a neighborhood on the north side that she hadn't visited in 3 years. A block of brownstones on a tree-lined street where a woman named Patricia Ennis lived in a ground-floor apartment with 2 rescue dogs and a career in nonprofit management and a friendship with Evelyn that had survived the Moreau years, largely because Patricia had the particular kind of stubbornness that refuses to be managed out of someone's life, regardless of how comprehensively that person is trying to disappear into a marriage. She knocked at 10:45. Patricia opened the door in a bathrobe with a glass of wine and looked at Evelyn's face and said, "Come in." and stepped back, and that was the whole conversation about whether she was welcome. They sat in Patricia's kitchen while the two dogs rearranged themselves on the floor, and the wine turned into tea because Evelyn's hands were doing the fine tremor again, and she didn't trust alcohol to be what she needed right now. She told Patricia most of it, not all, not the federal pieces that weren't hers to share, but the shape of it, the bones of the last 5 days, and what they'd cost and what had happened in that stadium corridor and the box afterward. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Evelyn had always valued most about her, the ability to receive a story without immediately converting it into advice or reflection or the speaker's own parallel experience. She just listened, her elbows on the kitchen table, her tea going cold, her eyes on Evelyn's face. When Evelyn finished, Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" she said. "No," Evelyn said. "Not yet." "But you will be." It wasn't a question. Evelyn looked at her across the kitchen table and felt the things she'd been holding back all day. Not grief exactly, but the accumulated pressure of 5 days of sustained precision, of performing certainty when certainty was a construction, of being the only person in the room who knew the full picture and carrying that alone, rise up through her chest and reach her throat and stop there. She pressed her lips together, breathed through her nose. "Yes," she said. "I will be." Patricia reached across the table and held her hand, and this time it wasn't the brief acknowledgement that Margaret had offered in the stadium box. This was the full, patient grip of a woman who was going to sit here for as long as it took, and Evelyn gripped back and looked at the kitchen wall and let herself be in the room without managing any of it. She stayed until midnight. When she left, she felt scraped clean in a way that was not comfortable, but was, she recognized, necessary. The feeling of having finally allowed the day to be what it was, rather than what she needed it to be for strategic purposes. She drove back to the hotel on Michigan Avenue and slept for 9 hours without dreaming. The legal proceedings moved with a speed that surprised everyone except Diane Voss, who was not in the habit of being surprised by outcomes she had engineered. The Tuesday meeting with Carl Weiss lasted 3 hours. Evelyn sat beside Diane in a federal building conference room that smelled like recycled air and institutional coffee, and answered every question with the complete documented clarity of someone who has organized their records for exactly this contingency. The forensic accountants Weiss brought into the room were thorough and occasionally aggressive in the way of professionals who have been misled before and have developed a baseline skepticism about cooperative witnesses. Evelyn did not find their skepticism offensive. She answered every question twice when asked, and once unprompted when she could see they needed the information before they had formed the question. By the end of the 3rd hour, the lead forensic accountant, a woman of about 50 with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who spent her professional life inside other people's financial mistakes, set down her pen and said, "The architecture is clean. The contamination is contained to Pruitt's insertion points. That's what we'll reflect." Evelyn nodded. She did not say thank you. There was nothing to thank anyone for. This was what the truth looked like when it was fully documented and properly presented, and that was all. The Thursday meeting with Vincent's attorneys was shorter. Diane had prepared for a negotiation and got a concession instead. The attorneys arrived with revised terms that addressed every significant point of the original Voss filing, and the only substantive discussion was about the timeline of asset transfer, which Evelyn agreed to extend by 30 days to allow for the complications created by the federal investigation's overlap with the legitimate holdings. She signed the preliminary agreement on a copy of the document that would be formalized within the week. She shook hands with the opposing counsel with the professional courtesy of people who have done their jobs adequately and have no particular feelings about each other, and she walked out of the building with Diane into the October air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. "That's the bulk of it," Diane said. "Yes. How do you feel?" Evelyn considered the question honestly, the way she had been practicing since Patricia's kitchen, the deliberate habit of not answering it automatically. "Like I want to go to work," she said. Diane looked at her for a moment, and something moved in her expression that was as close to warmth as Diane Voss got in professional contexts. "Then go to work," she said. Sterling Global Events opened formally in the 2nd week of November. The name had been chosen without deliberation. Sterling, because it was hers, always had been, the name she had been born with and had set aside for 7 years inside a marriage and was now simply reclaiming. Global because she intended to mean it. Events because that was the work, the actual work. The thing she was very good at and had spent 7 years doing at a level of excellence that no one outside a very specific set of corporate relationships had ever fully seen, because she had been doing it inside someone else's structure and under someone else's authority and toward the amplification of someone else's name. Not anymore. The offices were on the 14th floor of a Michigan Avenue building with windows that looked north toward the lake and west toward the city grid. And she had chosen them because of the light, the particular quality of Chicago morning light coming through north-facing windows, clean and consistent, and without the dramatic seasonal variations of southern exposure, the kind of light you can work in without thinking about it. She hired 4 people in the first month. A senior event coordinator named James, who had spent 8 years at a competing firm and left because the competing firm had stopped listening to him. An operations manager named Sujin, who had a background in sports entertainment logistics, and whose interview response to a complex venue management scenario had made Evelyn set down her pen and say, out loud, "That's exactly right." A financial director she poached from a hospitality consulting firm she'd worked with during the Moreau years, and an executive assistant named Rosa, who had applied with a cover letter that spent 4 paragraphs explaining what she understood about how event companies fail, and 1 sentence explaining that she intended to help this one not. She hired Rosa immediately. The first contract, the Fortune 500 technology company at Navy Pier, ran in the 3rd week of November. Evelyn was on site from setup through breakdown, which was not something the CEO of an event company needed to do, and which she did anyway because this was the first project that was entirely hers, and she needed to know every element of it from the ground up. She needed to know where the lighting techs were staging their equipment and which caterer was going to be 12 minutes late with the 3rd course service, and which AV subcontractor had a tendency to reinterpret cable management instructions and how the security configuration interacted with the venue's emergency egress protocol. She knew all of it. She had always known all of it. She had just for 7 years been knowing it in service of something that was not Sterling Global Events. The event ran cleanly. The client contact, a VP of marketing who had hired her based on a referral from 2 degrees of separation and had been professionally skeptical all the way through the planning process, the kind of skepticism that belongs to someone who has been burned before and has made a decision not to let it happen again, found her at the end of the evening during the teardown and said, without preamble, "I'll send you the Q2 contract Monday." She thanked him with the professional restraint of someone who understood that expressing the full extent of what she felt would not serve the relationship. And she waited until he was gone and the venue was emptying before she allowed herself to stand in the middle of the stripped Navy Pier event space with her clipboard and her radio and feel the thing she felt, which was not triumph and was not relief, but was the deep, animal satisfaction of competence fully expressed in the service of something entirely your own. She stood there for maybe 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. Gerald Pruitt was formally indicted on 11 counts in December. The proceedings were not public in the way that major criminal trials are public. They were the particular procedural publicity of financial crime, dense with documentation and largely incomprehensible to anyone without a forensic accounting background, which meant they received coverage in the business press and almost none in the general media. Evelyn read the indictment when it was filed. She read it once, carefully, the way she read everything, for the structure, for what it confirmed, for the places where the documented record aligned with what she knew, and the places where it revealed things she hadn't known. She made 3 notes in the margins of her printed copy and then filed it and did not take it out again. She was asked by a journalist from a financial publication to comment on the Pruitt case and its relationship to the Moreau organization's legitimate holdings. She declined through Diane's office with a statement so brief it was almost not a statement. Sterling Global Events has cooperated fully with federal authorities and has no further comment on matters under active legal proceedings. That was all. She was done giving the past more space than it had earned. The Moreau syndicate survived, diminished. Vincent had always been, whatever his other qualities, operationally intelligent. He understood the leverage points of his own organization, and having been stripped of the financial architecture Evelyn had built and the legal protection Gerald had provided, he restructured around what remained with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who has no interest in self-pity as a management strategy. The federal investigation ran its course and resolved without charges to Vincent directly, The cooperation he had extended from the moment of that phone call in the stadium corridor had been, as Weiss had suggested it might be, strategically valuable. He was not the same. That was visible even at the remove of the city's professional grapevine, the second-hand reports and contextual inferences that Evelyn processed without seeking them out. The feared, absolute authority of the pre-stadium Moreau was gone. What replaced it was something more careful and more bounded, and she suspected more honest about its own nature. Whether that was growth or simply reduction, she couldn't say, and didn't spend time trying. She heard in February, through a source she trusted, that Danny Rourke had left the Moreau organization and was consulting for a legitimate logistics company on the South Side. She felt something about that she chose not to examine too carefully because it was simpler and more functional to file it as information and move on. The Sterling Foundation for Professional Restoration was incorporated in February on a Tuesday afternoon in the same conference room on Wacker Drive where she had signed her preliminary divorce agreement 4 months earlier, which she considered a reasonable reclamation of the space. The work it did was not glamorous. It was not the kind of foundation work that generates coverage in the lifestyle sections of newspapers or photographs well at charity galas. It was specific and procedural and required sustained attention to the unglamorous details of how women in professionally damaging situations actually needed help, which was mostly legal resources they couldn't afford, financial literacy they hadn't been permitted to develop, and professional contacts who would take them seriously on the strength of a referral from someone whose judgment was trusted. The first cohort was 12 women. Evelyn met with each of them individually in her office on Michigan Avenue, in the clean north-facing light, across a desk that had only her name on its provenance. She did not tell them her story. She did not believe that her story was what they needed. What they needed was the forensic accountant and the contract attorney and the career placement specialist and her phone number, and that was what she gave them. 2 of the 12 found employment in their previous fields within 60 days. 3 required legal proceedings that ran into the spring. 4 were still in early stages of rebuilding when the foundation's first formal reporting period closed. The remaining 3 had found paths that were not the ones they'd originally pursued, and were navigating those paths with the particular resourcefulness of women who have learned, at cost, exactly what they are capable of. Evelyn tracked all 12, not to manage them, to know. Margaret Moreau attended every foundation event. She attended not as a donor performing attendance, she had made her contribution and the contribution spoke for itself, but as a participant in the substance of the work. She sat in the meetings. She listened to the women who wanted to talk. She said, occasionally and without drama, things that carried the weight of someone who had made her own accounting and found it wanting and was spending the remainder of her life doing differently. At the spring dinner, standing beside Evelyn in a room full of people who had come through something and were still standing, Margaret said, "I used to think that loyalty meant protecting the people you love from consequences." Evelyn looked at her. "What do you think now?" "That consequences are sometimes the only protection worth giving." A pause. "That knowing better and doing nothing is its own form of choosing." She looked out at the room. "I chose poorly, for a long time." "You chose differently when it counted," Evelyn said. Margaret considered that. "When you forced my hand." "When the situation made the choice available," Evelyn said, "you still had to make it." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then, "You're more generous than I deserve." "I'm practical," Evelyn said. "Generosity and practicality overlap more than people think." Margaret looked at her with the brown eyes that had seen everything and made their accounting, and something in them shifted in a way that Evelyn recognized as being as close to peace as a woman of Margaret's particular history was going to get, which was probably close enough. On a Thursday evening in late spring, with Michigan Avenue doing what it does in May, the trees in their new green, the lake light faint in the sky above the buildings, people moving on the sidewalks with the loosened ease of a city that has survived another winter and is only now beginning to believe it. Evelyn was in her office finishing a client proposal when her phone screen lit up with a number she had not changed in her contacts and had not expected to see. She looked at it for a moment, picked it up. A text. 3 sentences. "I wanted to tell you I'm sorry. Not for the lawyers, not for anything procedural. For what I did to someone who deserved better than what I gave her." She sat with it. She sat with it longer than she expected to, not because she was uncertain about what to do, but because she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the message had landed somewhere real, had reached a place she had assumed was closed, and she was going to let it be what it was for a few minutes before she decided anything. What it was, she concluded, was true. She believed it was true. She believed that Vincent Moreau was sitting somewhere in this city, having written 3 sentences that he meant, and that meaning them was probably the most honest thing he had done in years, and that it had cost him something to send them. She also understood with the clean, unsentimental clarity she had been working toward for 7 months that truth and sincerity were not the same as repair, that some things, once broken at the load-bearing level, do not get rebuilt. They get replaced with something different that occupies a different space and serves a different function, and the replacing is not a failure. It is simply what is accurate to the situation. She deleted the message, not with anger, not with satisfaction. With the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to deleting anything that has been received and processed and no longer has a function, cleanly, without ceremony, the way you close a file when the work in it is done. She set the phone face down on the desk. She looked at the window. The May evening was still light at 7:30, the long northern twilight of late spring, the sky above the buildings doing that particular thing it does when the sun is down but the light hasn't entirely decided to leave yet. She had a conference call in 15 minutes. A prospective client, a European sports federation with a major event bid in progress, looking for an event management firm with the specific combination of corporate credibility, crisis experience, and operational precision that their scale required. The kind of contract that would, if she got it, define the company's trajectory for the next 2 years. The kind of work that had been waiting for her, patient and real, behind everything else. She pulled the brief toward her on the desk. She opened it. She began reading. The work was the work. It had always been the work, not the empire, not the marriage, not the complicated human architecture of loyalty and betrayal and the uses and misuses of love. The work. The thing she was very good at, the thing that was entirely hers, the thing that had been waiting through 7 years of building someone else's kingdom for her to come back and claim her own. Her phone rang. Conference call. She picked it up. Sterling Global Events, she said. This is Evelyn. She listened. She took notes. She asked the questions that needed asking, in the order that made structural sense, with the calm, comprehensive authority of someone who understood the scope of the project and was equal to its demands. Outside, Chicago moved through its spring evening. The lake sat at the end of the city's grid, dark and enormous and permanent, the way it had always been. The city laid itself out in its ordered geometry from the lakeshore west to the horizon, lit and moving and entirely indifferent to any individual human story, which was not a cold thing but a true one. The city did not care. And the city's not caring left you alone with your own life, which was where your life needed to be. The call ran 40 minutes. By the end of it, she had a second meeting scheduled and the quiet internal certainty of someone who has identified a project whose scope they understand and whose requirements they are built for. Not confidence exactly. Something more settled than confidence. The recognition that comes when what you are and what you are doing finally occupy the same space. She ended the call. She closed the brief. She sat for a moment in the chair in her office with the Michigan Avenue evening coming through the windows and the north-facing light going slowly to blue and her company's name on the door and the work she had built arranged around her like a structure designed to hold. Then she got up. She turned off the desk lamp. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She walked to the door and she turned off the office lights. And she stepped into the corridor and she pulled the door closed behind her and heard the latch click, and that small, ordinary sound, the click of a door closing on a workday that was done, was the most satisfying sound she had heard in 7 years. She took the elevator down. She walked through the lobby. She stepped out onto Michigan Avenue into the May evening and felt the air on her face and smelled the lake and heard the city doing what the city always did, which was everything, simultaneously, without pause. She walked to her car. She drove home through the ordinary traffic of an ordinary Thursday evening. She thought about what she needed to do tomorrow and whether she had anything worth cooking and the particular texture of a life that belongs entirely to you. Not the dramatic texture of crisis and strategy and sustained precision, but the quiet, sufficient texture of choosing your own hours and answering to your own judgment and building something with hands that are finally, after a long time, building something that will have your name on it when it is done. That was it. That was the whole of it. The tickets that Vincent Moreau had taken to New Jersey, believing they would crown a new queen, had instead done something he had not planned and could not have anticipated. They had been the last thing. The last thing Evelyn needed to stop waiting for him to become someone he wasn't going to become. To stop building inside a structure that would never belong to her. To understand that the door she had been standing in front of for 7 years, not quite leaving, not quite staying, had been open the entire time. She had walked through it. The rest was work. The rest was time. The rest was the long, honest, unglamorous business of a life rebuilt from its actual foundations. Not the foundations of a marriage or an empire or someone else's idea of who she was supposed to be, but the foundations she had come with, the ones that had always been there, the ones that turned out to be more than enough. She drove home. The city moved around her, enormous and indifferent and bright, doing what it always did. She was part of it. She was herself inside it. She was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where she was supposed to be.